thrilled that we've got a good number of people for this conversation for this evening. So I'm really delighted to welcome you. Our attention has been on many things over the course of the last 8 months, and we've had lots of things on our mind. So probably for many of us, some of the kind of details of what's been happening in Israel over the last 8 months has not been at the forefront. So we may have kept up with some of the broad headlines, but not with the reality of the impact that COVID has been having on civil rights and civil society in Israel. So I'm really thrilled that in conjunction with the New Israel Fund, this evening we're going to be welcoming to ALIF some speakers from ACRI, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. So hopefully we're going to rectify this kind of gap in our knowledge over the course of the last few months. For us, we know that COVID has had a huge impact on our society, and of course, we're a very different kind of a place. So hopefully through this evening, we will find out about the challenge of freedom of expression in Israel, the impact of COVID on the Arab minority, citizens from the Arab minority in Israel, and broadly on the vulnerable and on vulnerable groups in Israeli society as well as hearing a bit more about ACRI's work in general. So as ever with these evenings, the structure is that we will hear from our guests for 20-25 minutes or so, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. I'm just having a look at how many screens we go over. We go over enough screens that probably the easiest way to do questions will be via chat. So what we invite you to do is to send your questions as they occur to you to me via the chat function. And then after we've heard from our guests, we will, I'll be able to ask your questions for you. So when you're sending a question by chat, please make sure you send it to me because I'll be the one who's looking at them. Don't send it to Adam or to Elif Zoom or to one of our guests because they'll be otherwise concentrating in a different place. So with no further ado, I'm really thrilled to welcome Sharon Abraham-Weiss, who is the Executive Director of ACRI, and two of her colleagues, Radia and Maskit, who are going to share their insights with us this evening. I'm going to hand over to Sharon to begin.
Hi, everybody. Good evening from Tel Aviv. Actually, from Tel Aviv, it's already good night. I'm glad for the opportunity to speak here. So as Rabbi Josh mentioned, I'm Sharon Abraham-Weiss. I'm the Executive Director of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, ACRI. Together with me, we have Advocate Maskit Bendel from the unit that deals with socioeconomic rights, and Advocate Radir Nicola, who's heading the unit of the Arab rights at the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. So ACRI is the oldest and largest human rights organization in Israel. And similar to Liberty, we are the only organization that deals with the whole spectrum of human rights. And Liberty is actually, we sit with them together in a body called INCLO, International Civil Liberties Organization, which is a body that consists of 13 organizations like ours from all around the world, like the American Civil Liberties Organization and others. ACRI today has about 50 people on staff, and we're 50 years old. It was established in 1972. We have a few methods. We deal mainly with advocacy and policy. Our largest department is the legal department, and we make change mainly via Supreme Court, but we bring landmark cases to Supreme Court, and we make a difference. We definitely make a difference. And we have two missions. One is to defend human rights. That's what we're doing via courts. But the other one is also important, is to change the discourse on promote discourse on human rights. And this is being done by the two other main departments. One is education. We have a department that composes curriculum on human rights, on freedoms against racism. And we actually work with the Ministry of Education, and we work with teachers mainly as agents. And another department is our public outreach, and you're welcome to go on our website, Facebook, Twitter, and other places, because it's, as we see it, it's not enough to make the legal change. So I'm happen to be a lawyer, but my real thing is the social change. And in order to make a social change, you need a whole toolkit. It's not enough to use one thing. I was asked to speak mainly about coronavirus. What were we doing since March 20, in the past 8 months? So for 8 months, we are at home to some extent. The default is working from home, but it's a lot of work. The reason we were chosen recently by the Marker magazine as an organization that is among the 100 most influential people or features in Israel is that we identified the challenges in March, and we realized what needs to be done, and we promoted the discourse on human rights in March. So if you're asking me, there are 3 phases, 3 battlefields that are being explored now. The first one is the COVID-19 itself, the pandemic that has implications on human rights. But nevertheless, the other one, which is very important, and I think is going to stay with us for a long time, is the socioeconomic front. I think the implications of what we see now will be greater, and I'm sure Advocate Maskit Bendel will speak about it later on. Just to give you the numbers, on February, we had 5% of unemployment in Israel. By now, it's closer to 25%. So it will have a lot of implications. I live in the center of Tel Aviv. A lot of shops are closed. A lot of places are to let, to sell. More homeless people on the street makes a huge difference. And this is on the socioeconomic front. And the third front that we're dealing with is the democratic deficit or democratic crisis. It seems that around the crisis, the pandemic, there are means that were used that are anti-democratic to what we experience. And I'll start with this. On the beginning of the pandemic, we identified 2 things. One, that the Shabak, the Shin Bet, the Secret Services of Israel, was given authority by the state in emergency regulations to follow us, to follow everybody in Israel in order to stop the pandemic. So from one hand, you're saying, okay, the pandemic is something big enough. Mid of March doesn't look like few months earlier. On the other hand, you're giving a body that has a destiny of dealing with terrorism and defending the country a lot of power to follow citizens. We went 4 times to court with this case. In the beginning, because it was emergency regulations, and then it became legislation. To make a long story short, at this stage, only this week, we got a decree from Supreme Court supporting us, asking the state to explain how can it be. Another thing, the courts were stopped, and we were arguing that not everything should have stopped, and there are other means. I mean, we're having this conversation sitting in different places around the world, and it's possible. We all got used to the Zoom, even a few months ago, we didn't think about using it. So the legal branch was, the courts were so important. We thought it was overused. So these are some achievements that we were achieving. A lot of achievement around the freedom of protest. A lot of people wanted to protest. And we argued that if you're doing with social distancing and masks and in the right, not making hazard to anybody in the pandemic, it's okay to protest, and it's part of a democracy to protest. And we had a lot of achievements on this front. I think something that happened a few hours ago. On another front, we're at the same time we're dealing with the pandemic, we're doing our regular things. Our regular things is, for example, achievement from a few hours ago. In the past 3 years, the municipality of Petah Tikva, a town in Israel, did not want to integrate children of migrant workers or refugees in the same kindergartens and schools like Israeli kids. So these children, the foreign children, were allocated to other schools separate from Israeli children. And tonight, this evening, we submitted an agreement with the municipality that they will integrate all the kids. So this is part of the regular work. So if I have to, before I will give the floor to my colleagues, if I have to summarize the main thing we were doing is the pandemic itself, the access to health, for example, to everybody, for the checkups, for the exams, and freedom of protest. A lot of issues around police violence, freedom of protest. People are sitting at home, as we all know, it's very hard, and around this and around socioeconomic issues. So I want to give the floor to Advocate Maskit Bendel from the Socioeconomic Rights Unit.
Can you hear me? Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm also from Tel Aviv. It's past 9 o'clock, and I'm welcome to my kids' room. They can stay late tonight, thanks to you. So I'm working in the Social Rights Unit as a lawyer for almost 10 years. And I deal mainly with issues of poverty and welfare. And when the crisis of the corona, the COVID-19 started, I will elaborate a little bit about everything that I'm mentioning now, but we found out that we are dealing with a state which is deeply sunk in bureaucracy. And this was evident for everyone, not only for people living in poverty. They already knew that very well. But it was it was evident for everybody that needed support from the state. And we also found out that all the decisions that we're taking regarding life of all the citizens and people in Israel, no consideration whatsoever was done in regards to the repercussions on people living in poverty. That is to say that the decisions were taken without understanding what the implications are. And we found ourselves in a race regarding every decision and every policy that was decided upon to make sure that the repercussions on people living in poverty will be taken into consideration. When the coronavirus crisis started, actually around March in Israel, we found ourselves with huge numbers of people who turned to be unemployed and rise in the cost of living, which dramatically affected people living already in poverty. And why is that? First of all, many people got fired or went on a vacation without being paid. And the unemployment allowance is not as high as a salary. So people that already lived on a very, very modest salary found themselves with about 80 or 70% of what they had as an income, and they had to support their families. The children stayed at home for a few months, and children that used to get, and I understand that also in Britain, it's an issue which is talked about these days, children that used to be fed in the schools and got free hot meal for every lunch, stayed at home, and their parents had to provide for them for all their needs, actually. And this was a huge blow for people that were depending on these meals, on these hot meals. They found themselves paying huge sums of money on electricity, on water, on food, and on communication, because people just stayed at home all day, all week, and the cost of living rose dramatically. And on top of that, there were some decisions that were made in, in a rush. I would say we were actually in a state of, I would say it was a trauma, because the state found itself in a situation which nobody knew before. And we had to take very, very rapid decisions regarding every aspect of life. So one of the things that we found ourselves doing is actually monitoring the decisions of the bank's commissioner, who decided one day to close all the banks. And that affected people on welfare allowance dramatically, because these people don't have credit cards, they don't have debit cards. They go to the bank, to the cashier, which they know for ages, and they take their allowance cash, and they live on it for a whole month. And suddenly they decided to close the banks a few days before the allowance was supposed to be paid to these people. Nobody thought about it. Nobody realized that this might cause a problem. So not only that we had to address them and find that nobody listened, we had to go to the Supreme Court of Justice in order to solve something which is in essence a minor issue of bureaucracy that should have been thought about before. And we succeeded, and the banks were open for 2 days for people to withdraw their allowances. So this is just a small example of the things we found ourselves doing during the first months of 2020. The issue of bureaucracy became to be very apparent. For instance, people in public housing who had to renew their lease or renew their entitlement to get public housing couldn't go to the office because it was closed. They don't have faxes at home. They couldn't even submit the application. So we had to contact the Ministry of Housing and shout that you must give some kind of solution to these people. You have to ease the bureaucracy. So they did, but they needed us to tell them to do it. They didn't think about it before. So it was a huge success, but it shouldn't have been our success. It should have been something that the state thought about. Another example is the issue of disconnecting electricity to people living in poverty. This is something that we're doing for almost 6 years now. And we are claiming that access to electricity is part of the right to human dignity. And we are now in the course of the second appeal to the Supreme Court of Justice regarding disconnecting houses of people who cannot afford to pay their electricity bills. So we had to demand that they will stop all disconnections of all private sector during the time in which people stayed at home. And it was the last months of winter in Israel, March and April. It's about like spring, but it can be quite cold at times. And then we came to July and August, which is hell. It's very, very hot here. And we had to demand that they will not disconnect people. And luckily, we succeeded. There is a decision now that there will be no disconnections of people in the private sector, even if they don't pay their electricity bills. But we are very much afraid of what will happen in the next few months, because the policy is you don't pay, you don't get electricity. Something else that we found ourselves dealing with is the issue of debts to different bodies, especially to the National Insurance Institute, which is the body who is supposed to give welfare allowances and to support people in their time of need. The state of Israel decided to grant all the citizens of Israel a special grant and to increase the grant for people on social welfare allowances. The National Insurance Institute demanded that all debts, prior debts to the National Insurance Institute will be taken away from this grant. So many people would stay with nothing. So we had to go to the Knesset, to the parliament, and demand that this section of the legislation will be completely erased. And I'm glad to say that we succeeded in doing so. But what I would like to emphasize is that we find ourselves, this might look like macro, but this is really micro issues, which are to do with bureaucracy and the lack of understanding of the simple man life, if to say so. what are the implications of every decision, not on my life or your life, but of people who are hardly making a living on every day. And I think if I can just sum up and say that the good thing that came out of these few months is that I think that people of Israel now understand what people living in Israel in poverty face every day of their life. And it even came to something that was a bit, I don't know how to say it. If it wouldn't be said, it would have been funny. But the Prime Minister of Israel stood on in a press conference and said, I am shocked by the bureaucracy which I'm facing in order to, support the citizens. Welcome, Prime Minister, to our life. Thank you.
So I guess it's my turn.
Yeah, Advocate Radir Nicola, the director of the our minority unity at ACRI.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the invitation. So as you just heard, the outbreak of COVID-19 in Israel brought to ACRI a lot of work, and this was relevant to almost the entire spectrum of rights. And this situation was also true in the context of the Arab minority in Israel. As you will see, or more correctly will listen from the short review that I will be doing shortly to the issues and cases we worked on, that it was precisely during this period that we had considerable success in many of the cases and appeals we made to the authorities. And I think that the main reason for the success, in my opinion, is that in most of the cases in which we succeed, in many of them without even having to go to court, there is one thing in common, and that is that the demands we raised were directly related to COVID-19 and preventing its spreading among the Arab minority. So even the authorities understood that it was not in the interest of any group in the country, not even the majority group, that the virus spread among the Arab population. But the scenario was different, and the willingness of the authorities to comply with the demands we raised was much less when these cases were connected to more to social and economic rights, to budget allocation for the Arab minorities. This is what I'm going to review, as I said. From the onset of the pandemic in Israel, ACRI addressed the lack of information about the virus in Arabic language on the Ministry of Health websites, Facebook pages. ACRI made many appeals for ensuring that the Arab public in Israel be fully informed about COVID-19. We demanded, for example, that the Ministry of Health to publish information about coronavirus patients from Arab villages and from East Jerusalem, that their residence and routes on the ministry's website and on the COVID-19 exposure map of the ministry in both languages, Arabic and Hebrew. Following our appeal, accessibility to relevant information on the Ministry of Health website was greatly improved. We also succeeded in our demand that the public broadcaster provide the real-time Arabic translation on evening news. We also worked for equal allocation of health services and not concentrating them in the Jewish localities only. For example, we succeeded in our appeal to the Ministry of Health for opening drive-through stations to check for corona in Arab cities and not only in the Jewish cities as it was in the beginnings. Another case that in regular days won't have been resolved so easily was our demand that the National Employment Services translate all the online forms required for receiving unemployment benefits to be translated into Arabic. And the authorities immediately announced that they are willing to do so, and that the translation will be conducted soon. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the willingness of the authorities to answer our appeals was much less when these cases were connected more to political, social, and economic rights and budget allocation for the Arab minority. An example for such cases is our appeal to freeze existing home demolition orders in the Negev, East Jerusalem, and West Bank during Corona, when people are supposed to quarantine at home. We approached the Deputy Attorney General on this issue on March, following news of the demolition of 3 houses in Kafr Qasim, an Arab town in the Triangle area. In the appeal, ACRI noted that the policy of home demolition is particularly unbearable at a time when a household is struggling with the pandemic and access to authorities and courts is limited. After 2 appeals and also from other NGOs, we get an answer from the Ministry of Justice informing us that it had been decided to adapt the enforcement policy of the planning and building law to the state of emergency, and mainly to freeze demolition of structures that, in which people live. Although unfortunately, the authorities repeatedly withdraw from their commitment to stall demolitions, claiming that their return to the old policy is in accordance with the walk back of emergency regulation and the gradual return to daily life. Another example is the online learning during COVID-19. In May, we submitted a petition to the High Court of Justice against the Minister of Education and the Minister of Finance, demanding that they make the online curriculum accessible to all students in Israel, and mainly to students in the unrecognized Arab villages, Bedouin Arab villages in the Negev, and also to Arab and Jewish students who live in a difficult financial situation. Now, according to a survey conducted in December 2019, only 43% of the Arab citizens said they used a computer at home, compared with 77% of the Jewish citizens. Unfortunately, at the hearing, 2 weeks later, and it was also upon the students' return to school, the court decided to dismiss the case and that ordered the petitioner to proceed directly with the new government minister and to try to find a solution, and if not, then to come back to court. Though it was stipulated that the Ministry of Education is obligated to look after the student in the underprivileged areas. Maybe the last example that I will give is the establishment of purification facilities for Arab citizens who died from COVID-19. On May, we appealed to the Ministry of the Interior and the Ministry of Health to establish purification facilities for those who died from COVID-19 in Arab society. The appeal followed upon learning that 4 such facilities were established only for the Jewish population in the 4 major cities, Holon, Beersheba, Haifa, and Jerusalem. And we, in our letter, we stated that ritual cleansing of the body is a religious obligation and a deep social and cultural custom among Muslim, Christian, and Druze, and that the ministry must make purification facilities accessible to non-Jewish Jewish citizen. In August, due to lack of response, we had to petition to the High Court of Justice, demanding the opening of the purification centers. This case is still pending, but since then, we filed the petition, 5 new centers were opened in the Arab society, and 2 centers is upon to come. Thank you.
Thank you, all 3 of you. I'm really grateful for your summaries of the work that you've been doing over the last few months. Whenever I host an evening like this, I always sort of feel strangely deflated by just how, and the stuff that we kind of take for granted, or if not take it for granted, at least have a reasonable expectation that a developed society has within it. And I'm always kind of amazed that Israel feels like it doesn't take some of those things. You can't take those for granted in Israel. So I'd love to just explore a little bit more some of these, because I think it's kind of shocking actually for us in the UK often. So Maskit, if I could start with you. I mean, I think one of the things we often don't talk about in the UK is just the level of poverty that there is in Israel for a developed society. I mean, you say that it's interesting that you kind of say that there is COVID has brought this to the forefront, perhaps, or at least the bureaucracy dealing with poverty to the forefront in a way that hasn't been seen before. But do you want to just say a little bit more about kind of the background that this is happening in? I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. Sorry, there we go, great.
During the last decades, there were some cuts that were made in the allowances supporting the survival of impoverished people. And ACRI was actually, Sharon can talk about iconic appeal to the Supreme Court of Justice, in which we attacked one petition that was to cut some of the most basic allowance. And unfortunately, we failed. But it was a very, an amazing failure, actually. So since then, we see movements in which some support is given more and some cuts are made. In general, you have people in Israel who are unemployed, cannot be employed because they lack education or skills to be part of the workforce, and are heavily dependent on the support of the country. Those people are very vulnerable because they don't have anything, backed. They can't even, they don't save anything. They don't have savings. They rely heavily on charities, on support of families and friends. And once the COVID started, those sources of support disappeared because many charities ceased to work or couldn't just, face the enormous need that they faced. And many people could not help one another because they themselves were in a wretched situation. So we had people saying we don't have anything to eat, as simple as that. And I know that some of my colleagues and many of my friends actually raised money to support families in need. Because once a person says, I don't have anything to eat, you can't start, writing and communication with the authorities and understanding why he didn't get his allowance this month. You have to help him immediately. So we found ourselves dealing with cries for help that we couldn't do anything about it. We couldn't do anything about it. And I think that Ghadir mentioned something which is I also see it in the Jewish society, that people that don't have the basic means to acquire a computer for their children at home, and now they need to to be on Zoom every day with the teacher. Many children just don't do it. They don't have internet. or their infrastructure is not enough to support a few computers for a few children. And it was a disaster. It was a disaster. And I think that what we saw, that I have to say some warm words about my country, because I think that Israel quickly realized that some urgent acts needs to be taken. And they started doing that little by little. But you know, the depth of poverty is tremendous. You can't just, you know, do little things and help these, you know, save the people. And you had almost 1 million unemployed. What do you do? How do you support all these people? A huge problem was is still is faced by people who are independent. They are like, they have small shops or small businesses. They were never employed. They paid their taxes, but they found themselves unentitled to anything, reaching really the level in which people said, we don't have anything to eat. So the state of Israel started to think, what do we do about it? Everything needs to be done in legislation. It takes a lot of time. I don't need to tell you about the situation of our government and the coalition. It's very poor. Things really go very slow. So I think that what we saw is how all the infrastructure, health infrastructure, the situation of hospitals, which is terrible. Our hospitals are overwhelmed and cannot even, you know, just when you have influenza during the winter, you cannot give proper medical treatment to people flooding the hospitals. So we have a problem with the education system. We have very large classrooms with a lot of children. What do you do when you need to separate them into two like bubbles, as some call it, or capsules, as we call it? You don't have enough classes to do that. You don't have enough teachers. So I think that what we saw is the bare and the sad situation in which we were already in. And when you have a catastrophe, then you realize that you don't have enough means, you know, to deal with that catastrophe, because you're already so impoverished in all your social infrastructures.
Mesquita, I'm going to stay with you for a little while if I can. I mean, a lot of what you're talking about, I think, resonates or is kind of mirrored in other countries as well. You know, we've had lots of increased use of food banks and the challenge of people who are self-employed here who haven't been able to access government funding. But it sounds like there's a kind of bureaucratic indifference in Israel, which is kind of seems to be sort of distinctive, perhaps. So what's the source of that? Where is that coming from? Is that does that reflect a genuine indifference to poverty from government in Israel?
I think that the main problem is that people taking decisions, and judges and politicians, they don't have a clue about how people in poverty's life look like. They never need to face those bureaucratic systems in which you need to get support right now, not in 3 months, and no back and forth with another document. You know, people didn't have printers at home, and they were supposed to submit applications to get public housing. You know, as simple as that. Now, I think the majority of the people, or maybe many of us don't realize what difficulties those people face in their daily life. But we learned about it now. And I think that maybe if I can be hopeful, maybe something will come out of it. You know, maybe something good will come out of it. But I don't know if it's an indifference. I think it's just lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, and lack of experience.
And is that poverty sitting in particular geographical locations or particular demographic social groupings? Where, just to give us a sense, you know, is it in the big cities, or is it in Haredi communities or Arab communities? Where does that sit primarily?
I think that it's, in the periphery. Of course, the problems are much more difficult. For instance, when you have problem with public transportation, and people in poverty don't have cars, they use buses, they use the train. If that stops, they can't go to work. They can't go to do shopping. If they live in back of beyond in the periphery, Israel, where you have to have public transportation to get food, then you're stuck. But I also think that, of course, you see poverty in Arab settlements and houses and villages and towns. Poverty there is very, very deep. And also the neglect of the state, which is now visible much more. We always saw it. Everybody knows that, but now we are dealing with, a catastrophe. But you have also poverty in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is a poverty in which you have many, many neighborhoods in which people in poverty are living. And it is considered to be, in the economic scale, in a very good place. But you have differences in the population. So I think that poverty is all over Israel, but in the periphery, it's much more evident and it's much more difficult. For instance, it's difficult to find work. If you're living in Kiryat Shmona or in so it's really hard for you to get a job. You don't have many opportunities, and if you don't have transportation, then you're in a problem. In Tel Aviv, you can just, you can take a bus and you can go and find a place to work. It's easier. Sorry.
No, it's interesting. I mean, I suppose my sort of naive shock about the reality of Israel is sometimes comes up.
Very grim, I know.
I suppose that another area of naive shock is about the kind of the reality of the Arab minority. So Radir, if we can just ask you a couple of questions, because I think the idea that you needed to force the public broadcaster to put Arab subtitles on primetime news reports during a pandemic, it's just it's almost unspeakable that you would need to, that should be an action that you would need to do. And what's underpinning that? What's going on within Israeli society that is where you found yourselves?
First of all, regarding the broadcast, I should say it's a big thing to get what we get. And I think I'm afraid that maybe this achievement will not be held after Corona. Now, everything that is mentioned by Maskit is relevant to the Arab minorities in Israel and even more. And she also mentioned that, and mainly because of the pre-existing condition before the COVID, that is all the gaps and the discrimination and allocation of budget in budget allocation and in the area of social and economic rights. And I think that what I'm thinking about is that after the COVID and what will be the condition in Israel in relation to the Arab minority, because as a group, I think that we will see that this will be the last group that will enter back the job market. We will maybe see a governmental plan like once it was called Wisconsin, something that kind of forcing people entering back the job market. This is what I'm worried about, actually. I think
it's amazing how often we forget to unmute ourselves still in the world, right? We've been doing this for 9 months and we still can't remember. Yeah. I mean, obviously you guys are doing great work, but there's also, I mean, real kind of action in civic society in Israel at the moment. So I think, Sharon, when you're speaking about freedom of expression and the right to protest, I think perhaps one of the things that we haven't picked up on here so much is just the extent of the protest that's happening in Israel at the moment, the extent to which there is a kind of social movement happening in terms of protest. Is your sense that kind of COVID was used as a cover for trying to suppress that? Is that what was going on behind the scenes of this?
It's not behind the scenes. I mean, on record, a lot of people were saying that this is part of it, the limitation. Now, as I said, I was speaking with other human rights organizations around the world, and definitely you need to do adjustment. I mean, it's impossible to think that the world today is the world like a year ago. We support the freedom of expression and for protest, but it's impossible to have these huge rallies because there is COVID-19 around. So how do you balance between those things? And part of the thing that we managed, actually, ACRI was managing to change, is the regulation for protest. If you are 2 meters one from each other and with masks, it is legitimate to have protests. So you probably saw on Rabin Square, there were footage all over, just small crosses where people can stand. So I myself, I was there a couple of times, and people are standing with a distance from each other, which is good enough. At the same time, you can have a protest. There was a lot of unrest when there was a stage that the government tried to ban the protests at all. When we had closure, they moved to neighborhood or domestic small protest instead of the big one in Balfour. Balfour is near the Prime Minister's house. And this was interesting. I felt like in a way that it became, instead of one big protest, a lot of small protests that were all around small neighborhoods. And I think it's more and more. I was driving today from Judea Desert to Tel Aviv this afternoon, and you could see all over the way, in every bridge, in Mevaseret, in Jerusalem, in other places, in every bridge, few people are standing with black flags. Now, it really was used in the beginning to try and block the freedom of expression. And there was a lot of accuses of police violence. Police started using methods that we haven't seen before to oppress this protest. And due to a very good work that was done by ACRI and other organizations, I think we managed to deal with it.
Can you say a little more about what sort of methods? Because I think we are again, sometimes we're maybe kind of naive from our position about the reality of what it might be like in Israel.
What is the reality? The reality is that we have a prime minister that faces indictment. ACRI is a non-partisan organization in terms of we do not support this party or another, but we do support the freedom of speech. And when we thought that the protesters' rights are being violated by using more violence, by using methods of police that we haven't seen before, not only machines or using non-lethal weapons, what is allegedly non-lethal weapons, but also methods like kettling, dividing the protesters and trying to close them, infiltrating police undercover within protesters in WhatsApp groups, or interrogating and trying to scare protesters without a background, or trying to arrest protesters for many hours, or hustle. So this, we try to get the greater picture, while other organizations supported by NIF were bringing lawyers to represent the protesters in situ. We were going to court with the phenomena, court and attorney general with the phenomena, connecting the dots. And this is our job, to connect the dots and saying, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in other places, last night, we saw more policies that were inappropriate. This was our job. And I think to some extent, we, in an optimist way, I think there was the public opinion in Israel and the pressure that was made here brought a change to the policy of the police while using it. It's not, it's good, but not great. Not that everything is great at this stage, but it's better than it was. And definitely our work made a difference in real time.
So it sounds like there is a a genuine distrust right now in terms of kind of the
Yes.
way in which authority is used in Israel against protests. And is that what makes the issue of track and trace and Shin Bet access to mobile phone records so problematic? Because of course we're also talking about track and trace. We also have, all around the world, people are trying to work out how we balance our civil liberties and trying to protect against a pandemic. But it feels like there's something more acute that's happening in Israeli society.
So the real thing with the Shin Bet, that it was in the balances between the separation in powers, you give the executive branch a lot of power over civilians, and I'm not sure afterwards it's reversal. I mean, you give a lot of power and then you say pandemic is over. I hope it will be over soon, and then forget it. B, there was something that was arbitrary. I mean, the Shin Bet followed your phones basically, and if somebody was 2 meters from you for more than 15 minutes, you would go to house quarantine if somebody else was identified. Now, I have a neighbor next door, okay? Might be 2 meters from me and more than 15 minutes. Although we haven't seen each other, I mean, this becomes arbitrary because you don't know where, and is it really happening or it's not really happening, and you're being followed basically. Now, in a democracy, you don't want it to happen, and I want to remind that during March, it was in emergency regulation, emergency status, so there was no even legislation, there was no public discourse or debate about it, and this was terrible. This immediately was canceled by Supreme Court. But later on, there was legislation, and these are questions that we are asking ourselves. And Israel happened to be the only country in the world, or the only democracy in the world, sorry. China, I think, is different. The only democracy in the world that was using its secret services to follow its citizens while the pandemic. And I think this should raise a red light saying, okay, what all the others are doing. I mean, with the whole world, we're sitting at home and facing the situation. Are we the only one that are doing it? Also, while the hearing in court, it was identified that the results were not that great, and there were lots of mistakes. People were sitting at home while mistakes, and I mean, it was too much. It was just too much, and I hope it would be stopped. And this week, we learned that the IDF was following citizens as well. And thanks to our lawyers, it was stopped. I mean, at least it was announced to be stopped this week. Another achievement of this week.
So we're coming towards the end of our hour. A lot of what we've heard has been challenging, to say the least. So perhaps I can ask all three of you just to speak a little bit about kind of the medium term or the long term, and your sense of kind of what the landscape of sort of society in Israel might be like, and what the journey there might be like. What is achievable, and what has to be done in order for it to be achieved. Let's start with you, Sharon.
Okay, so what is going to stay with us for the long term? Definitely the socioeconomic issues. I think people are sitting at home, although they're getting benefits at this stage. A lot of places wouldn't be reversible, and the gaps are growing. The inequality is growing now, as Maskit was describing. I think I have 2 teenagers that are studying at home, and they're lucky enough to have computers and rooms, each one of them, and that's great. But I'm sure if you're checking their cohort and comparing with them, if you are coming from less privileged background and you don't have a computer per child, you're gaining gaps now. So this is something that is going to stay with us. I'm not sure how the economy can recover from what I see in my eyes around, and that's before the numbers. The pandemic itself, hopefully there will be a vaccine soon, either Russian or Pfizer, or I don't know. There are lots of talks tonight about it, but I hope we'll get over it. socioeconomic really disturbs me, and the democratic deficit. I think means and tools that are being used now by executive branch, it's going to be harder to give up on them.
Okay, I was hoping for something a bit more optimistic. So maybe Radir or Maskeet can speak a little bit more positive.
Can I say one more optimistic thing I want to say?
Yes, please, go ahead.
I think, okay, no, I think the people, the protesters, with the numbers of protesters we see on the streets, makes a difference. I think people, as people have more power, feel more powerful, and it makes a difference, because a lot of people that I know, some of my friends that never went protesting before, suddenly it's their main issue now in life to protest. They feel that they can make a difference. They go out in the streets, and I think people are more involved now than they used to be.
Yeah. Radir.
Yeah, I wanted to say that maybe the optimistic thing will be that we all think that one day all of this period will be over and we will be out the COVID, and but unfortunately, like Sharon, I think that the long term is going to be a big challenge for us all, and for the Palestinian minority in Israel especially. As you all can see, economically and socially, we all expect that it will be a big challenge for the whole world, not only Israel. And for minority especially, it's going to be hard. But on the other hand, the last years in Israel, we know that there is at least an awareness between the government and the authorities that there is a big need for a budget allocation, there is a plan, an economic plan of 5 years that was extended this year for 2020, for 21. And I hope that in the long term there will be another plan with an adjustment to cope with the new situation.
And Maskeet, I'm going to give you the final word.
I'm trying to think of something optimistic, but I have to agree with my colleagues. I'm really worried about the gaps that we're already seeing regarding children's education, and access to good education. I can tell you that around me, I see people investing all their resources in their children's education, giving them private tutors, because my children just, she just started the first grade. She still doesn't know how to read. So if I'm lucky enough to support her, then I do it. But what about other families, other children? I'm really, really worried about it. My hope is that maybe regarding the health system, there will be some kind of understanding that we cannot go on like that, that something needs to be changed, that the system is collapsing. Maybe. My fear is, when time we have the immune and we'll be immune, we'll forget about it. That's my fear, because that's the way I see things happening. It comes in waves here in Israel. I also identify very much with what Sharon said. I see people involved, people who never even thought about going out to the streets and shouting and, holding signs, do that now. And I think it's really good. It's really good, because people start to understand that they are the important part in the thing that is called the state, and they have to be heard. That's it. I'm sorry. I think that it's mixed. I have mixed feelings and mixed worries, I think.
Before we finish, I do want to just give Adam Ognall from New Israel Fund a word, but Sharon, you wanted to add one more thing?
Yeah, I want to say about the Jews and Arabs in Israel something positive. I think what we saw in the Arab minority, the compliance with the health is is very good. I mean, usually we used to say ultra-Orthodox and Arabs together, and while there is a lot of criticism about the ultra-Orthodox community, I think the Arab population that is there's a high percentage of people on the health industry, doctors and nurses and pharmaceutical among them. I think the compliance, as we see the numbers, is pretty good, and I'm wondering if it will bring to a different treatment as population, because apparently the COVID-19 is colorblind, race blind, and religion blind, and it affects all of us at the same time. It means that we have to treat all the populations more equally in terms of access to health and other means.
So we are really incredibly grateful to you, Sharon, Radir, Maskit, for giving us your time. Must be about 10 o'clock for you now, so probably bedtime. But before we finish, you've come to us in conjunction with New Israel Fund, our friends at NAF UK. We're grateful to Atira and Adam for making this possible. Adam, I just wanted to give you a moment just to close us our evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Josh, and thank you everyone for holding this event. I guess this is one way as an ELIF member of Rabbi Josh getting me to come to one of the community's events. So thank you. Sort of as Rabbi Josh mentioned at the beginning, as a community, our focus has been pulled in many different directions over the last few months. I hope tonight has given you a flavour of how hard COVID has hit Israel, and also how civil society has responded both in helping the most vulnerable, but also making sure that democracy is not a casualty of the pandemic. And I'm sure you heard from our speakers just how serious our friends at ACRI are taking these challenges. The reason why we had the opportunity to put on this evening is that we awarded earlier this month to ACRI the New Israel Fund UK Human Rights Award. And this is an award we give out every year. And over the last few years, we've had this lovely tradition of one of the winners coming to speak on the Friday night service at the show. And obviously that's not possible. So it was great to be able to do it in this format and go into a bit more detail. For those not familiar with NIF, we are sort of the leading organization advancing democracy and equality in Israel. And the key thing is that it's a partnership. It's a partnership of Israelis and diaspora Jews who share common values and share common concern for Israel. And that is very much at the core of what we do. And I hope, and I can see from the intensity of how people were listening tonight, that common concern remains despite all the many challenges that we all face as individuals and as communities and as countries as we work through this current very difficult time. So thank you for giving another hour of your life to Zoom. And thank you again to Rabbi Josh and Ayla for allowing our speakers from ACRI to be with us this evening.
Thank you.
Adam, thank you. And thank you again to our guests. We wish everyone a good evening, good night to our Israeli guests. And please do join us next week for the last of our A-Little Lockdown Thursdays. Each one is looking at a different thing which matters a lot to A-Lith. So last week we talked about British politics, today about Israel, and then next week we've got a special looking about the impact of pandemic on the performing arts with some of our members and special guests. So please do join us at 7 o'clock next Thursday as well. Thank you again to Sharon, Radir, Maskit. Good night.